with you. I love being around pastors. It's all I know. I'm a pastor's kid, a missionary kid. My grandparents actually spent 50 years in Africa, where my mom was raised in Kenya. And so she married my dad. They went to the West Indies, to some islands that you've never heard of before. One of them's gotten famous because of tourism in the last decade, which is St. Lucia. But outside of 10 years ago, you wouldn't have heard of that island either. And that's where we grew up. Been around church planters and pastors from before I was born, because I'm riding a wave that began in my family years ago. So I love these conversations. I've loved what I've learned already, just from Stan's first presentation. And just so you know, that question was the hardest question that I've heard in a workshop for a while. What is empowering leadership? And he answered that with one word. That blew me away, because that's not an easy question. And so that just elevated my respect for Stan right off the bat, that you've been able to study hard enough to be able to give very good, short, one-word answers that just is point on. That's exactly the barrier to growth, is the fear of control, or is fear and systems that are designed for control. But I'm just glad to be here. I'm going to tell you a little about my story. My wife and I got married 24 years ago yesterday. So 24 years married, and so her grandparents grew up they spent 50 years in India and the Philippines, missionaries over there. My wife was raised in Holland and Hong Kong. And then her dad left the mission field to become a pastor in Seattle. He planted a church in Philadelphia in 1990. And having graduated from Bible college, and I was serving as a youth pastor in a church on the West Coast, I went out to Philadelphia to join him shortly after the start of that church, and spent 6 years with him in the mid-90s. And during that time, really felt the call of God on my heart to plant a church. I just didn't know anything about it. I'd never led anything on my own before. So I stole a page from John Maxwell and went out and tried to interview leaders all over the country, and just to figure out, well, if I could have an hour of your time to tell me your story, and what do you know about church planting? It was one of the most, it didn't work out like in John's book. Like, that's supposed to work. Like, you go ask a leader for an hour of their time, and they're going to put inspiring thoughts in you. And most of the people I met said, well, don't do it. And that's a terrible idea. And we need, certainly not someone like you. We're looking for someone like it with experience. I was 28 years old at the time. But I met, through that research, I met this man, Gary Rohrmeyer, who is part of this movement called Converge, that used to be a group of Baptists. I wasn't Baptist. I actually grew up, I grew up in the Assemblies of God. So grew up very interdenominationally, though. My mom also grew up interdenominationally. So I always felt weird when I came back to the U.S. and I got around that movement. I was like, what is this? I don't even understand, literally. So you'll get that later. I knew I wanted to be a part of God's kingdom, but I didn't know where I fit. I didn't belong in the denomination I was raised in, and came across this group of people who were dedicated to planting churches, and cast a vision. We're looking for someone to plant a church in Indianapolis, and would you go? And my wife and I said no for a year. We had never been there. We'd never set foot in that state. I'm not from the Midwest, and I thought planting a daughter church in Philadelphia was much more me. I grew up very multiculturally, and I just didn't see, the Midwest Bible Belt as the place I was going to, plant a church. But in 1999, my wife and I went to Indianapolis just to pray, because they asked that we would go and pray and see if it was God. And in the short course of about 3 months, God answered so many specific prayer requests and opened the doors that in 2000, we packed up our stuff, we sold our house, I resigned from my job, cast vision that we were going to go, and we moved to Indianapolis, me and my 3 little kids, 7, 4, and 1. And driving into that city that day, I mean, it's all exciting, to have people back you and to raise support and to have this dream. And I had that sinking feeling the moment the truck showed up at our house in Philadelphia. First of all, the guy that said he was going to bring his truck over didn't tell me it was a flatbed truck. So, so here we loaded up all our stuff with this big tarp over it and ropes. I mean, the Beverly Hillbillies was moving to Indiana that day, that's for sure. So we're driving, and I've got this, truck in the rearview mirror, and I'm thinking about pulling into Indianapolis, and it just got, I don't know, what am I doing? And fear will hit you hard. But got out of the car, moved into an apartment we'd rented online, and that would begin a journey of going out and making connections in the community, building relationships, networking. Some stuff I want to talk about in our session today. But when you go when you're a pastor and you don't have a church, you don't have a building, and there's no money really, and there's no members, just survival says you need to go out and talk to people and go out and connect with people. And here is the typical reaction. By the way, that's my family, and my son plays football. He's a senior at Wheaton College, so if that doesn't mean anything to you, but I'm excited about that. My daughter's going to Indiana Wesleyan this fall. I have a daughter that's in high school, and my wife and I, again, 24 years yesterday. Yay, God. All right, so let me see here. This will work. Am I out of range?
No, it shouldn't be. Sometimes it does.
Well, okay, you can be my my connector. So that's what it felt like when I would step out and tell people we're here to plant a church, and they would look at me just like that, like some kind of an alien. And I mean literally everybody, like not pastors included, because pastors don't like church planters, right? So I would go say, I'm excited, I want to start this church, and I would go make all these community contacts, and I started off with pastors, and I think there were 2 pastors in all of Indianapolis that were really happy that we had showed up. But most of the time, people don't understand what you're even talking about. I spent the next 6 months going around making community contacts, networking, joining community groups, talking to people, learning, prayer walking, trying to figure out what's a Hoosier. Somebody just explained that to me for the first time. 13 years I never knew, but I just figured out an explanation. And he can tell it. Decided that, okay, after 6 months, I set a goal at the 9-month mark, we're going to have our first Bible study. And so I decided that I was going to go out and do just a straight mathematical equation, that if I visit 1,000 homes and I can get 5 families to show up, that will be enough to start a small group, and this church will launch off with 5 families. So literally, I scheduled the time and every day would go out. I took my kids with me for the cute factor, to hopefully get past the front door. And my wife made cookies, and I did the hard work of going and visiting over a 3-month period 1,000 homes in my community. The night came, and we opened up the clubhouse of the apartment complex. We went and bought food and got the kids all cleaned up, and we waited, and 7 o'clock came, and it was a 0 show. Nothing. 8 o'clock came, and the kids are going, "Daddy, where are the people?" "Shut up, I don't want to talk to you." And it was just awful. About 8:30, a Christian family that we had met from another church that just was curious drove by, and when they saw that nobody had showed up, and I was trying to make an explanation, but there's just none, and he took me by the shoulder and says, "Darryn, I just don't really think this is God's call in your life, Oh. It was so painful. And you know what my reaction was? I was mad at God. I was mad at God because I'd said, "Lord, I've prayed. I've walked through this community. I have desire. I care about lost people. I'm not lazy. I'm not in sin. I don't know. I was confessing sins that I had never even thought of. I just didn't want anything to be in the way. And I thought, I've done everything that I know how to do. And here's the thing about this. The church in Philadelphia, my job was an evangelism pastor. So I'd led hundreds of people to Christ by that point. And I don't know what happened, but there was a season of time in the beginning of this church where it was like the Lord just went like this, like took his hand off and said, "Okay, let's just see what you can do." I didn't realize it, but I go into this little closet. Click that. There was this little closet in the walk-in closet. One more click. Of the apartment complex. That's what I felt like right there. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a church planter. I'm just an unemployed guy in a closet. And maybe if you're a pastor, you felt like that at some point where you're saying, I don't know, this is not working. And what else can I do? But I don't know what else I can do because I'm a pastor. I can't really. And I was angry with God because a lot of things that I had asked for. And so I stayed in there for about Now, I thought I was having a breakdown, probably was, in there reading the journals. And in the quiet of reading the journals, I saw all the things God had done to get us to come to this place. Our house had sold in 8 hours. There had been a bidding war in our home. The first person I'd led to Christ in Philadelphia was the first person to give, and had given an enormous amount of money in just a moment's time. I mean, there had been specific things, like my father-in-law was one of my closest, not only my father-in-law, but he's my closest friend. I love him. And so the idea of just saying, I'm not going to plant a church for you, as you had thought, and I'm going to leave and take your daughter and your grandkids and go to Indianapolis, leave the denomination that you're a part of. And I just thought he was never going to bless that. And he told a story about when he wanted to go overseas, his father had forbid it and chastised him, and he said he would never do that to his kids, a story we didn't know. And one after another, I had written all of these stories of how the hand of God had been graciously on me. So now I'm sitting here in reality going, I don't understand. And I heard a whisper, and I didn't hear words, but I mean, you hear this, you get this, suddenly the thought crystallizes in your head that has to be God, because it would never be you. And it was, what if I brought you here to fail? And I had never considered that option, because I'm not going to fail. I mean, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to go over or under or around or through or get help. I'm not above going and asking people for advice or learning, but it terrified me. What if I've asked you, what if I brought you here to fail because I want to do something in you that you're not even aware of? And man, that was the hardest thing to ponder. Well, after about a day of letting that sink in, I realized I don't have any other options. And God, if you brought me here to fail, well, what else am I going to do? Where else would I go, right? To whom else would I go? No one. So I remember just praying another prayer like when I got saved the first time, which was, Lord, I totally surrender this to you. I don't know what to do. I've done everything I know how. I'm not above this assignment. I know you brought me here. Maybe it's not to plant this church. And then I began to think about the call of God. What is the call of God? Are we pastors because we have a job at a church, because there are members, because we have a parking spot and it says pastor, or a business card? What is it that defines you and me as a shepherd of people? I realized it's none of those things. And I remember having this moment of like, well, God, you've called me to come to this city. I thought it was to establish. And I realized in that moment I've been talking an awful lot about starting a church, which was all of the things that the call of God wasn't. And I remember thinking, you know what? I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know I'm supposed to be here. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what results we're going to have. But I will just pastor. I am a pastor. I know the call of God. I know that He's called me to this city, and I'm just going to be the best pastor I can to the person I meet tomorrow morning. And I had a list of appointments that I needed to make and so on. And then it dawned on me, what am I doing in this closet? Because I prayed this prayer of surrender. It felt like 1,000 pounds had rolled off my shoulders, and I started realizing, what am I doing in this closet, in an apartment? I have plenty of money to buy a house in this community. But you know what? That's when I realized I was afraid of failing. I had all this money, but I wasn't going to buy a house because I was kind of keeping all of my options open, right? So I'm sitting there thinking, I'm in this apartment, in an apartment complex. So I just flew open the door, came out of the closet, and told my wife, well, I didn't tell her like that. That's not what I meant. But I did say, we're buying a house today. And she thought I was really crazy. And we went out and we went out looking for a home. We got a realtor, we went out, and in the purchase of that home, I met a realtor, and I met a mortgage broker, and I met a homeowner's insurance guy. And after the work got it done in my heart, I didn't even talk to them about really planting a church. I just engaged them without any of the pressure of trying to start anything, just to engage them as just human beings. They had some church involvement. One was a Catholic, one was a former Christian church person that had been in Sunday school, I think, as a little kid. I think he remembered bringing in the sheaves or something like that, but that's all he remembered. And then there was this realtor who had no church experience at all. And in the course of that 3 weeks of transaction, God led me to people he was saving already. And those 3 families, they came to know Jesus. One across a coffee table at a mall, one in a coffee shop, and one in the car outside of his office. And that's how Heartland Church got started. We had the first Bible study in our home February 4th, 2001. And that was, I think, there it is. That's everybody. And that's all the people that were involved in the kids. I think there were 17 of us total. And by the time, that was February, by the time Easter came around, we had about 35 people because, see, they're not church people, and their friends weren't church people, and they just started inviting their friends to come. They said, come and see, what's happening in my life. And by the time there was 35 people in our house, my wife said, I think you better find another place to go. So we moved into a Holiday Inn, and we were in there for a little while. And then eventually there was an old computer store that went out of business, and it was like a Circuit City building. And one thing that had happened, that after the 9 months of being in that period of just learning about my community, I'd learned my community really well, and I realized that there's not nearly enough childcare in this community. And if we can meet this need in the community and serve this need to create, I think the hospitals, the 3 hospitals serving my little part of Indianapolis, we're going to have 10,000 live births in the next year. And there wasn't nearly enough, and I think there was a 92% double income, husband and wife working. So it's all about daycare. But I didn't know anything about daycare. I've never run one before. Haven't started that business. But I thought, well, if we could find somebody that could run it, and if we could find the money, if we could find a building, well, we should do it. No problem, right? And I started going to prayer about those 3 things because I said, God, I don't know if this idea is from you, but I began to pray. And when you pray, there's praying, and then there's praying and working your praying, which is, well, if there was a business plan, what would it look like? So going to somebody and asking for help and having them write me what a business plan would look like, and how much money would it actually take? I need to know that. And how many square feet would you need to know? And defining reality around what is it that, it's impossible. I didn't have any of that, but what would it take? And then started to pray. And God led me to the man who bought that building after the company folded, a local businessman, bought that building on speculation. And he hadn't been able to rent it for a couple of years. And I went and shared my vision with him. Of course, the realtors with the signs, they wouldn't talk to someone like me. And so I thought that was over. But then I met this guy through one of the people in our group, and I shared the vision with him. It turned out his grandfather was a Christian church minister way back in the day, but he was a God-fearer, but not like a man of peace. And he says, you know what, I'll tell you what, I'll let you lease that space for $6 a square foot, which was crazy because it's a huge, like 18 normally in that area. Now it's going to be $10,000 a month, give or take, which I didn't have. So I just said, okay, prayed about that. Went back and started telling people about the amount of money we needed to raise, put an ad in the newspaper to recruit a daycare director for this new daycare that was starting, even though there was no daycare. But I just wanted to see, Lord, if you have somebody waiting. And you know what? There was a family moving from another part of Indiana, and the husband was searching in the classified ads, found our ad. And this lady had run a daycare of over 100 people, and they were just close. They were seeking. They just started going to a church. They weren't Christians, but they were just about there. They were right on the edge, and so brought them into our home. Started talking with them. They were one of the first people we baptized in our new little church that was meeting in this Holiday Inn. And long story short here, guys, God answered every one of those requests. And in by August, we were in one more. There's the whole church now. You can't really see it, but there's the front of the old computer store. We just gathered there. It looks like there's about 25 adults that particular Sunday. And again, a few other Christian people that have come along, but a lot of people that weren't. And then we were going to start this daycare. We launched it in September, and guess what happened just a few weeks later was 9/11. This was now 2001, just to catch you up. 9/11 happened. So now all of a sudden there's these families in this daycare. They aren't looking for church, but they're all in crisis like all of us were. And there's all these people and their friends that they know, and we decided to launch the public services 4 weeks after that. And I just told them, I said, I'm going to start preaching you. How did this all get started, all this mess? We're going to start in the book of Genesis and tell you how it happened. And we had about 154 people show up the next week. That's how Heartland Church got started. And I just need you to know that story before we start going into all of this, because it's based on some very simple principles. It's not like I'm a missionary kid. I didn't go to business school. But I know how to pray for things. I've watched God do miracles overseas, and I've seen the power of God, touch people's lives and heal people's bodies and redeem and restore people that were hopeless and lost. And so I have these convictions, and I have a lot of faith, I think. I think faith is a big gift of mine that God gave me. But there was, about 75 adults in that room. So by God's grace, though, here we are all these years later, and by September, we should have baptized our 2,000th person in our church, and praise to God for that. And we are on 2 campuses in 2 locations. We filled out that computer store. That's a children's auditorium now. We've rented this whole. I think there's one more picture of that. There's a worship center in our high school, and there's the computer store now in a different setup. And I preach 5 services on Sunday. So the fact that I'm here today is a testament to Stam's arm twisting. But I tell you what, it's exciting to see people. See, let's keep this about the discussions. It's not, it is about tracking numbers, but every number is a person. Every person is a story, and every person matters to God. And there's a deep conviction that there's a name and a story attached to each one of those, and that's what we're after. So that's a little bit of the story of how we got started. We're going to launch our 3rd location in February, and we've also planted 7 churches in the Indianapolis region in that same time. And the husband of the daycare director who was baptized, he was our first church plant pastor in 2006. So we came to Christ in 2001. He was discipled in our small group. He started taking courses at an online Bible college. And he became our student pastor, and then we launched him out with the first 65 families in downtown. So it's a true indigenous kind of a church plant. We have converts who are on our elder board today, which I love that idea of indigenous church leadership. They're the best kind. And so that's a rapid history. As you know, there's lots of painful stories in the midst of that. I don't know, Stan's graph that he showed you a minute ago, that's like, taking highlight points. But you all know, like, growth doesn't happen in a line. It's like a zigzag like this. So we spike off of big days, and then we come down to reality, and we spike off another big day again, and that's how it works. But that was more of a normalized line. So let's talk a little bit about, though, just the key issues. Where are we going to go? And I hope that I answer some of your questions. And would you write down stuff that you hope that I would, if you have a question or two, and if you would put that on a piece of paper or something, give that to Stan, and then tomorrow I'll make sure that I don't miss anything, because I don't want to just talk about what I want to talk about. I want to talk to where your heart is. But I'd like to talk about 3 spheres of influence that you have. If we're going to talk about impacting our evangelistic growth engine, well, there's 3. You're going to have to click this a lot to make this all work. There's the first sphere, and click it again. That's the people connected to you, like the people in your sphere as the leader. Everything rises and falls on our leadership and on who we are. And like I think Stan said a bit ago, no one's going to do much unless they see you living out the gospel and living out the mission of Jesus. It's important. So even though things change, we're going to, in our roles and our jobs over time, there's something missional that needs to be happening in us. We're going to talk about that. And the next sphere is the people who are connected to the people in your church. So all the people that are in your church right now, they know a certain number of people. And, I just wonder, how many people in your community, think about this question, know who you are and what you do? They're not in your church, but they're in your community. They know you and they know what you're doing. Like, they know what you're about. You have a relationship with, and I wonder how many people that might be. Like, how big is that sphere? Like, how how involved are you, or how connected are you to the community that you're in? It's just a question in defining reality. And then you'd ask the question in the next sphere, how many people would you say the average person in your church, who's in their sphere? So, if some of the times when I'm coaching my church planters, and I'll say, let's say you've really gotten out there in the last year, and maybe 200 people in the community know you, and maybe each of the 50 people that are in your launch team or in your church, or 100 people that are in your church, let's say they know. What do you think? What do you think an average good number would be? People in your church, like what's the size of an average person's sphere of influence? 70. Yeah, about 60 or 70 people. Okay, but how many do they really know and have conversations with on a weekly basis, say? 10. Yeah, probably somewhere 10 at the small end, maybe 20 at the max, maybe somewhere in there. Okay, so that's there's a potential. And then you have like whatever the population is of your community and what you imagine the unchurched population is. Now, you can imagine it, or you can have have a study done that can give you some information. But there needs to be a strategy for every one of those spheres. In other words, what's your plan for engaging lost people at each one of those spheres? And it's not like if you ignore the center and the inner circle, and your strategy is just to approach it from, say, a marketing angle, and how am I going to get the word out to the community? There's a disconnect in the core. If you just try to do it all yourself, you can't get very far. You're going to be able to just win a number of people, but the key is alignment. How do you get what you're doing, what's happening in your people's lives, and what's happening in the sowing seeds that you're doing in your community? How can you get that to align? So we're going to talk about a strategy. Hit that 3 more times, about modeling what you're modeling. We're going to talk about equipping the people in your church for spiritual conversations, and not just the spiritual conversations about sharing their faith, but also sharing their experience. So there is a go and tell component, but there is a come and see part of that component, equipping people to invite people to come and see what God is doing, and also to prepare them. And then the last part is just sowing awareness, sowing and reaping awareness to the unconnected masses of people that are all around us. And so let's just talk a little bit about the people blindness that we have. First of all, if you're a pastor, a busy pastor like me, it's so easy just to get caught up in just hanging out with our staff and with our leaders and with the administration and with the study that we have to do by ourselves. And so in a church planting world, like when I started, my coaches were telling me, like, you need to be out 75% of your time in the community. Well, you know how that's a lot of time. I mean, but survival depends on that. You're going to spend 75% of your week. And my coach was adamant about that, because he says, Darryn, only God and me care that you're in Indianapolis. So you need to go out there and meet some people, and don't sit around, dreaming up, or don't take the team, the church planting team that you go with, because happens today a lot. If you guys don't know this, but you send out 3 or 4 young guys that have the passion to plant a church, and they spend all their time hanging out at Starbucks talking about what it's going to be like. Okay, so 75% of the time, how are we going to go out and impact and meet new people and network in our community? And then even after they launch, we hold our church planners, we say, we want you to spend at least 20% of your time in that first year to continue to do that. We know you can't do 75% now because you've got to preach and you've got stuff to do, but this can't come to a screeching halt. You need to be modeling some things. So I don't know what your percentage is for you, but we're going to talk about, is there a time that you have just scheduled, or is there some place, is there some, even if it's an hour or 2, but is there something regular and consistent that you have decided that I'm going to model having conversations with people who are far from Jesus? Okay. Then equipping people for evangelism was the strategy to train them. And, wouldn't it be amazing if we could train 1/3 of the people in our church over the course of a year, that we could have a training session that we could teach people the very basics of having spiritual conversations? And then how do we create strategies to connect to the unconnected masses in our community? So flip that one more time. I'm going to talk about the first one, about you having personal spiritual conversations. And maybe just for a little exercise, could you take a minute and write down the names of just people that are close relationships to you? Just take a minute and just write down everybody that you know these are close people to you. And let's just say not your wife and your kids, but outside of that, okay? Out of that one parameter, write down the list of some people. Actually put names on paper. Go.
People who are believers or not believers?
Just who are close to you. It doesn't matter. Just people who are close to you. Let's get as many names as you can write down. You won't have to share this with anybody, by the way. This is just for you. About 30 more seconds or so. I don't want to push it too long, but. Okay, so now that you've got like your list, let's put some initials beside each of their names. Put NC for the ones you know absolutely for sure they're not Christians. And then put an NS, like if you're not sure. Not really sure if they are or not. They might be. And then, put down C if you know for sure. Yeah, they're a Christian. Okay, so this exercise is just about awareness. It's not about you don't have to share this with anybody. It's just about what Stan said a moment ago about just defining reality of where you are now. And I've learned to love reality defining insight and feedback, because the great thing that you can do with that is, even if you find out that there's something that, I haven't been doing this. Like, one of the things you can stand up in front of people and say is like, oh my gosh, I haven't been doing this. That's it. That's all you have to say. I've been doing this. And then you can say, but you know what? God has really impacted me about this, and here's something I'm going to start doing, and I want you guys to watch me and follow me. So there's no downside to seeing where reality is. You just want to see it so that you can then say, okay. And I think that's an important, because I know this as a pastor. I go through seasons where, at the beginning of the church, I was just around unbelievers all the time. In fact, the believers that came to my church in the beginning, I used to do the whole, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and I had the rod and the staff, right? So I had the little hook to pull people close, and I had the rod to beat off the wolves, right? And I did lots of exit counseling, because there were people that were coming to the church because they were mad at some other pastor, or they had some chip on their shoulder about this, and I would just say, hey, have you gone and talked to that pastor about that? Oh, well, you need to go work that out before you come here. I would just say that to people. So I was always around lots of non-Christians, and I was very clear about, trying to keep a good culture, healthy culture. But over time, I would go through seasons when I would do the same exercise somebody did with me. I'm just passing on to you, and I realized I've just spent the last 6 months around only Christians. And the only people that I'm close to are Christian friends. And I know some people, but I wouldn't consider them close. And I realized that, so this is something that never stops. If we get into this, you'll see why as we get into the next session. But there's always entropy at work. Entropy is that thing where things are always coming apart slowly. And so even our best plans. So I like to take that, when I do a couple times a year and I get away and I'm kind of doing a vision retreat and praying, this is one of those exercises that I will do. And from time to time I've got up, not just on this issue. I remember a time when I did not preach on money at all for the first 3 years of my church plant. Because you know what all the surveys said? Unchurched people don't want pastors talking about money. And I went, that makes perfect sense, so I'm just not going to talk about it, except for when I really need something, which then I became exactly what they feared. And one day I realized that that was the dumbest thing I've ever done. Like, okay, so I didn't want to talk about it, but then when I actually teach the principle about it, the only time I'm teaching the principle is because I actually need something, and I'm confirming what they thought to be true. And so I actually did that. I remember one Sunday got up, and I said, listen, folks, I need to apologize to you. I've not been a good pastor in this area. I have a confession to make. And everybody has their attention right there. What's he going to say? I says, I've not talked to you about something that is the most important thing. Jesus talked about this, half of his parables. And so, anyway, just to say, I have been there, and I will, okay, that's something God's convicted me of. It's the first step of recovery. I've failed, but will you guys join me?